Sometimes the places that haunt us most aren't castles, cemeteries, abandoned asylums, or dark forests. Sometimes they are beige office buildings. Recently, I went to see the Backrooms in the movie theater. And what struck me wasn't the horror. It wasn't the monsters or the mystery. It was the feeling. You know the one. The fluorescent lights buzzing, the endless hallways, stained carpet, the strange sense that I had somehow been there before. Not literally, but emotionally. And as I sat with the feeling afterwards, I found myself wondering, why does a place that we've never been feel so familiar? Why does an empty office building feel more unsettling than a haunted mansion? And why did a single image posted online in 2019, a photograph of yellow walls, buzzing lights, and seemingly endless rooms, resonate so deeply with millions of people around the world? The answer, I think, has very little to do with horror and everything to do with being human. Because beneath the internet lore, beneath the creepypasta, beneath the film itself, the back room taps into something ancient, something psychological, spiritual, and mythological. It speaks to the experience of being lost between what was and what comes next. It speaks to the threshold. And if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that I love a good threshold. So let's start with the modern myth. The Backrooms began, fittingly, on the internet. A single image, one premise, that if you accidentally bloop out of reality, you find yourself trapped in an endless maze of empty rooms. No windows, no exits, no obvious purpose. Just fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of damp carpet, and the unsettling certainty that something is wrong. What's fascinating to me is how quickly this idea spread. Millions of people saw those images and immediately understood the feeling. Not the location, the feeling, the vibes. Because folklore has always worked this way. Every culture creates stories that reflect its fears, its uncertainties, its unanswered questions. Medieval Europeans feared dense forests. Travelers feared crossroads. Sailors feared the open sea. There were places where ordinary rules no longer applied. Places where people disappeared. Places where something strange might happen. Today, many of us don't spend much time in forests, but we do spend time in office buildings, schools, hotels, parking garages, corporate spaces designed for efficiency rather than belonging. And so our folklore evolves. The haunted forest becomes the empty office building. The fairy mound becomes the endless hallway, and the monster changes shape. The human experience underneath remains remarkably similar. Folklore doesn't disappear, it updates. And perhaps the Backrooms are one of the first truly digital myths. A story born not from oral tradition around a fire, but from collective experience online. A modern campfire tale for an age of fluorescent lights and internet forums. To understand why the Backrooms resonate so deeply, we need to talk about a word that has become central to this podcast. Liminal. The word comes from Latin limen, meaning threshold. Anthropologist Arnold van Gennep introduced the concept while studying rites of passage in the early 1900s. He observed that traditions tend to follow 3 stages: separation, liminality, and reintegration. You leave one identity behind, you enter a threshold, then eventually emerge transformed. Later, anthropologist Victor Turner expanded on this idea. He described liminality as being betwixt and between. No longer what you were, not yet what you are becoming. And suddenly, the Backrooms start to make a lot more sense. Because they aren't really a place. They're a psychological state. Think about grief. You're no longer living the life you once had, but you haven't figured out who you are without that person. Think about divorce, motherhood, chronic illness, graduation, career change, spiritual awakening, trauma recovery. These things are all liminal spaces. The old map no longer works. and the new map hasn't arrived. And that uncertainty can feel terrifying. Psychological research consistently shows that uncertainty increases stress and anxiety. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We like certainty, we love maps, and we like knowing where we are. The Backrooms offer none of that, just endless transition. No arrival, no resolution, no clear destination. And perhaps that's why they feel so familiar. Because many of us are living there. Not literally, but emotionally, socially, collectively. And yet, that still doesn't fully answer the question. Why do these images create such an immediate reaction? Why does a photograph of an empty office building feel more unsettling than an image of an actual dangerous place? After all, most of us have spent time in spaces that look remarkably similar to the Backrooms. The architecture itself isn't threatening, so why does it feel threatening? Part of the answer may be cultural. Part of it might be psychological. And part of it may be rooted in the way our brains make sense of reality itself. Because long before the Backrooms became an internet phenomenon, philosophers, psychologists, and neuroscientists were already asking a similar question. Why do some places feel wrong when nothing appears to be wrong? Why do certain places feel familiar and unfamiliar at the same time? And why can an ordinary hallway suddenly feel so unsettling? To answer that, we need to explore a concept that sits at the heart of horror, dreams, memory, and human perception itself: the uncanny. If the Backrooms are a modern myth, then the feeling they evoke is ancient. Long before the internet, long before horror films, and long before creepypasta forums, human beings were trying to understand a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of obvious danger, not the fear of predators or disasters, but the strange discomfort that arises when something feels both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. In 1919, Sigmund Freud wrote an essay called The Uncanny. He described the uncanny as something that is strangely familiar, something that should feel known and safe, but instead feels unsettling. Not because it is completely foreign, but because it is almost familiar. A doll that looks almost human. A reflection that seems slightly off. An empty house that feels occupied. A hallway that continues just a little too far. Freud wrote that the uncanny often emerges when something once familiar returns in a distorted form. And that feels remarkably relevant to the Backrooms. Because nothing in the Backrooms is inherently frightening. There are no blood-stained walls, no ominous symbols, no obvious threat. Just office walls, carpet, drop ceilings, and fluorescent lights. Things many of us have encountered hundreds, if not thousands of times, and yet something feels profoundly wrong. Why? Part of the answer may lie in how the brain constructs reality itself. Many neuroscientists now describe the brain not simply as a machine that reacts to the world, but as a prediction machine. Researchers like Carl Friston and Andy Clark have proposed models of perception known as predictive processing. According to these theories, your brain is constantly making predictions about what should happen next. In many ways, you don't simply see reality. You anticipate it. You expect it. You continuously compare what you expect to what actually occurs. Imagine walking through your own home in the dark. You know where the furniture is, where the walls are. You have an internal map. Your brain is constantly predicting what comes next. Most of the time, those predictions are correct. And when they are, you feel safe. The world makes sense. But when prediction and reality stop matching, that's when something shifts. Your nervous system pays attention. This is sometimes called a prediction error. And prediction errors can create anxiety, not because danger is present, but because certainty is absent. Think about dreams for a moment. Many dreams feel strange, not because impossible things are happening, but because impossible things happen and nobody seems to notice. You find yourself in your childhood home, except it isn't quite your childhood home. The rooms are wrong. Doors are in different places. The layout just doesn't make sense. And yet, somehow, you know exactly where you are. The back rooms evoke a similar feeling. You recognize the architecture, but the architecture refuses to behave the way the architecture should. The hallways repeat. The rooms continue endlessly. There is no destination, no outside, no point of orientation. And suddenly, the map in your brain begins to fail. This brings us to another fascinating area of neuroscience. In 2014, researchers John O'Keefe, May Britt Moser, and Edvard Moser received the Nobel Prize for their discoveries related to spatial navigation. Their work identified what are often called place cells and grid cells, specialized neurons that help us understand where we are in space. In other words, your brain is constantly building a map, not just of your city, of your neighborhood, but of every environment that you enter. Your nervous system likes landmarks. It likes reference points and orientation, a sense of where you are and how to get where you're going. But the back rooms deny all of those things. Every room looks similar. Every hallway feels repetitive. There are no landmarks, no destination, and no horizon. And without those reference points, many people experience a subtle sense of disorientation, not just psychologically, but also neurologically. But perhaps what fascinates me most is that the backrooms don't just disrupt our sense of place. They disrupt our sense of meaning. Because humans don't merely navigate physical environments. We navigate narratives. We want stories. We want progression. We want cause and effect, beginning, middle, and end. The backrooms offer none of that. No explanation, no resolution, and no obvious purpose. And perhaps that's why they feel so unsettling. Because psychologically, the back rooms represent a place where meaning has temporarily broken down. The hallway continues, but we don't know why. The rooms repeat, and we don't know where they lead. We are moving, but we don't know exactly toward what. And if we're honest, there are moments in life that feel exactly like that. Moments when the story we were telling ourselves no longer fits. Moments when the future is unclear, and when the map disappears. Perhaps the discomfort of the back rooms isn't simply that they're strange. Perhaps it's that they remind us of experiences that we've already had. Grief, illness, loss, transition, and transformation. Those moments when we find ourselves wandering through unfamiliar territory with no clear sense of how long the journey will last. The uncanny, then, is not merely a feature of horror. It is a feature of being human. And nowhere is that more visible than in the spaces that feel almost familiar, almost safe, almost understandable. But not quite. And that not quite is where the mystery begins. Because once we leave the familiar world behind, we enter territory that humanity has been exploring through stories for thousands of years. The labyrinth, the underworld, the dark forest, the descent. And that's where we're headed next. Perhaps that's where the backrooms become more than an internet phenomenon. Because if the discomfort they're creating is rooted in something fundamental about human perception, our need for orientation, meaning, and certainty, then we're no longer talking about a creepy image on the internet. We're talking about something much older. Something that appears again and again throughout human history. Because long before psychologists were writing about the uncanny, long before neuroscientists were studying prediction errors and cognitive maps, human beings were telling stories. Stories about getting lost and wandering into places that existed between worlds. Stories about crossing thresholds and finding themselves somewhere strange, unfamiliar, and transformative. And what fascinates me is that these stories appear everywhere. Different cultures, different eras, different landscapes. Yet somehow, they keep describing the same experience. The forest, the cave, the labyrinth, the underworld, the dark road, the place where the old self can no longer survive, and the new self has not yet emerged. In other words, the Backrooms, just wearing a different costume. One of the oldest patterns in mythology is the journey into the unknown, crossing into a place where ordinary rules no longer apply. And perhaps one of the clearest examples is the labyrinth. In Greek mythology, the labyrinth was constructed to contain the Minotaur, a creature that was half man and half bull. Most of us learn this story as children. The hero enters, the hero slays the monster, and the hero escapes. But from a psychological perspective, that's only part of the story. The labyrinth itself is the point. A labyrinth is not a straight path. It is confusing, disorienting, it forces surrender. There's no shortcut, no way around. The only way out is through. And that feels remarkably familiar when we think about major life transitions. Grief is a labyrinth. Chronic illness, recovery, you enter expecting a map and then discover there isn't one. Another story that comes to mind is the story of Persephone. If you've listened to this podcast before, you know that I have a soft spot for Persephone. She begins as the daughter of Demeter, goddess of the harvest. Then one day she is taken into the underworld, and everything changes. The story is often framed as a tale of loss, a mother losing a daughter losing her innocence. But it's also a story about transformation, because Persephone doesn't return as the same person who left. She becomes the queen of the underworld. She gains knowledge, and she learns how to move between worlds. And I think that's important, because in modern culture, we often imagine transformation as something uplifting, a breakthrough, a revelation, a triumphant moment. And mythology shows a different story. Transformation usually begins with disorientation, with descent, uncertainty, and getting lost. The underworld comes before the crown. The same pattern appears in countless stories. Odysseus must journey among the dead. Dante travels through Inferno before reaching paradise. Even in modern storytelling, our heroes wander through dark forests, abandoned buildings, alternate realities, and strange landscapes. Why? Because these places represent psychological truth. The journey isn't geographical, it's internal. The landscape mirrors the transformation. And perhaps that's why the Backrooms resonate. Not because they introduce a new story, but because they reactivate an ancient one. The story of becoming lost, wandering, and finding yourself somewhere you never intended to be. Then slowly realizing that the place itself is changing you. What I find particularly interesting is that these stories rarely begin with courage. They begin with confusion, fear, resistance. The hero doesn't usually volunteer for the underworld. The wanderer doesn't seek out the labyrinth. The threshold appears unexpectedly, just as it often does in real life, through diagnosis, death, divorce, betrayal, a pandemic, a career ending, or a spiritual crisis. One day, you know exactly who you are. And the next day, you are standing in a hallway that seems to stretch forever, looking for a door, looking for a map, trying to understand where the old story ended and where the new one begins. And perhaps that's where mythology and psychology begin to overlap. Because if psychology asks, what happens when we lose our sense of certainty? Mythology asks, what wisdom waits on the other side? And that question brings us into another dimension of this conversation, because for many traditions throughout history, these threshold experiences were not merely psychological, they were spiritual. And while mythology often tells these stories through gods, heroes, and symbolic landscapes, spiritual traditions throughout history have asked a slightly different question. What if getting lost isn't merely part of the story? What if it's part of awakening? Because across cultures and centuries, people have described periods of profound uncertainty that ultimately became transformative. Moments when the old way of understanding themselves no longer worked. Moments when meaning dissolved and certainty disappeared. Moments that, in many ways, feel remarkably similar to standing in an endless hallway searching for a door. And that brings us to the spiritual dimension of the backrooms. One of the most surprising things I've discovered while studying psychology, spirituality, and human transformation is that almost every tradition contains some version of the same story. A person who becomes lost, not geographically, but existentially, spiritually, psychologically. They enter a season where the familiar world no longer makes sense, and for a time, there are no answers, only uncertainty. In Christian mysticism, this experience became known as the dark night of the soul. The phrase comes from the writings of St. John of the Cross. He described a period in which an individual no longer experiences the certainty, comfort, or connection that once sustained their spiritual life. Prayer feels empty, meaning disappears, and the old relationship with the divine no longer functions. And yet, according to St. John, this is not a failure of faith, it is a transformation of faith, a necessary dismantling before something deeper can emerge. What strikes me is how often people encounter this same process outside of religion entirely. When a marriage ends, or a loved one dies, a diagnosis that changes everything, a career collapses, an identity no longer fits, and suddenly the map disappears. The familiar landmarks are gone. You find yourself wandering, not knowing who you are or where you're headed, and not sure of how long you'll be there. Psychologist and philosopher William James explored many of these experiences in his work, The Varieties of Religious Experience. Published in 1902, James collected accounts from individuals across different traditions who described moments of crisis, despair, and uncertainty that eventually led to profound transformation. What fascinated James was not the specific belief system, it was the pattern. Again and again, people described losing their footing before discovering a new way of understanding themselves and the world. The breakdown often preceded the breakthrough, the wandering came before the insight, and that liminal space came before the transformation. Across cultures, we find similar themes, not identical practices or identical beliefs, but remarkably similar patterns. Many indigenous traditions include periods of solitude, retreat, or intentional separation from ordinary life during times of transition. Vision quests, coming-of-age ceremonies, and other rites of passage often involve entering uncertainty rather than avoiding it. Not because uncertainty is pleasant, but because it can reveal something. The land becomes teacher. Silence becomes teacher. The threshold becomes the teacher. And while traditions vary widely among nations and cultures, there is often an understanding that transformation requires relationship with community, with the natural world, and with something larger than oneself. Not endless certainty, but relationship. This stands in sharp contrast to much of modern culture. Today, uncertainty is often treated as a problem to solve as quickly as possible. We seek answers immediately. We want clarity, direction, and closure, and we are deeply uncomfortable not knowing. And yet, many spiritual traditions suggest that wisdom emerges not from certainty, but from our willingness to remain present in uncertainty long enough to learn from it. There's another element of these traditions that I find particularly interesting. Many describe threshold experiences as times when the boundary between worlds becomes thinner. Not necessarily in a paranormal sense, though sometimes it is part of the story, but in the sense that ordinary reality becomes more permeable. Dreams become more vivid, intuition gets louder, questions that once seemed settled suddenly reopen. People begin noticing patterns, symbols, coincidences, synchronicities, experiences that challenge their assumptions about how reality works. Carl Jung devoted much of his life to exploring these experiences. Jung coined the term synchronicity to describe meaningful coincidences that appear connected even when no obvious causal relationship exists. For Jung, these moments were not necessarily supernatural, they were invitations, opportunities to pay attention, to notice what was emerging from beneath conscious awareness. And perhaps that's part of what happens in liminal spaces. When the old story falls apart, we become more attentive, more observant, more willing to notice what we previously overlooked. And this brings me back to the Backrooms, for in all of their horror, they are strangely empty. There are very few answers, little explanation, and no clear narrative. Just room after room after room. And perhaps that's what makes them feel spiritual in a strange way. Not because they contain answers, but because they force us to sit with questions. Who am I when I don't know where I'm going? Who am I when certainty disappears? Who am I when this map no longer works? These are spiritual questions, not because they require religion, but because they require us to grapple with meaning. And perhaps that is why liminal spaces appear so often in both spiritual traditions and paranormal stories, because they occupy the same territory, the threshold, the place where ordinary reality feels less stable. Categories begin to blur and certainty loosens its grip, and where people sometimes encounter things that they cannot fully explain. Dreams, visions, ghosts, ancestors, premonitions, synchronicities, experiences that seem to exist somewhere between psychology and mystery. And if we are going to talk about the Backrooms, we can't ignore that connection. Because long before the internet imagined endless hallways, human beings were already telling stories about places where reality behaves differently. Places where the ordinary world gives way to something stranger, and perhaps more revealing. Which brings us to a question relevant right now. Why has a story about endless empty rooms resonated so deeply with people living in the 21st century? Why this myth? And what might it reveal about the world that we're living in today? Perhaps that's the question I've been circling this entire episode. Why did this particular story emerge when it did? Because if mythology tells us something about the cultures that create it, and folklore reflects the fears and belongings of the people who tell it, then the Backrooms may have something important to reveal about the world that we're living in. After all, myths do not emerge in a vacuum. They emerge because they resonate, because they give shape to something people are already feeling, often before they have words for it. And when I think about the Backrooms, the endless hallways, the fluorescent lights, the emptiness, I find myself wondering if the story is less about horror and more about loneliness, less about monsters and more about disconnection. Because perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Backrooms is not that you're trapped, it's that you're trapped alone. There's something profoundly strange about the Backrooms. They're full of evidence that people exist and completely empty of people. Hallways, conference rooms, carpeted corridors, drop ceilings, exit signs. Spaces clearly designed for human activity, but no humans. No conversations, relationships, no community, only traces. Evidence that people were here once. And maybe that's why these images feel so unsettling. Because in some ways, they mirror the experience of modern life. In 2023, the U.S. Surgeon General released an advisory on loneliness and social connection. He described loneliness and social isolation as major public health concerns. The report cited research suggesting that chronic social isolation carries health risks comparable to smoking up to 15 cigarettes a day. Think about that for a minute. Loneliness is not just a feeling. It's not just sadness. It's not a personality trait. It has measurable impacts on physical and mental health, cardiovascular health, immune functioning, depression, anxiety, cognitive decline. Human beings are social creatures. Our nervous systems evolved in relationship. We are literally wired for connection, and when connection is missing, the body notices. Psychologist John Cacioppo spent much of his career studying loneliness. His research suggested that loneliness functions almost like a biological alarm system. Just like hunger tells us that we need food, and thirst tells us that we need water. Loneliness tells us that we need connection, not because we're weak or failing, but because connection is a fundamental human need. And yet, many people today are experiencing unprecedented levels of disconnection, which raises an uncomfortable question. How can we be more connected than ever before and feel so alone? One answer may lie in the difference between connection and contact. We have more ways to contact each other than any generation in human history. Text message, social media, video calls, group chats, online communities, constant access. And yet, many people report having fewer close relationships than previous generations. Fewer places where they feel known, and fewer places where they feel they truly belong. Sociologist Ray Oldenburg wrote about what he called third places, the places that exist outside of home and work. Coffee shops, community centers, libraries, local gathering spaces. The places where relationships naturally form. Over the past several decades, many of those spaces have declined, and along with them, opportunities for informal connection. We have become increasingly individualized, increasingly mobile, and increasingly online. And while technology has brought extraordinary benefits, it has also changed how we relate to one another. This is where I think the timing of the Backrooms becomes particularly interesting. Because although the original internet images appeared in 2019, much of the visual language feels distinctly rooted in the 1990s. The beige walls, the office buildings, the industrial carpeting, fluorescent lights, architecture of late 20th century corporate life. For many people, those spaces evoke a strange nostalgia, a memory of malls, office parks, waiting rooms, school hallways, places that once felt normal and now feel oddly abandoned. There's a term for this: hauntology. Hauntology refers to the feeling of being haunted by lost futures. The futures that we imagined, the promises we were given, the worlds we expected to inherit. And when I look at the Backrooms, I can't help but wonder if that's part of what people are responding to. Not only fear, but mourning. Mourning a world that no longer exists, or perhaps never existed at all. And then there is the larger cultural context. Political polarization, economic uncertainty, climate anxiety, rapid technological change, artificial intelligence, and shifting of social norms. Many people feel as though the world they understood is changing faster than they can adapt. The old maps don't work. The future feels unclear. The familiar becomes unfamiliar. And suddenly, we're back in the territory we've been discussing this entire episode: liminality. Anthropologist Victor Turner described liminality as being in between. And I think that there's a strong argument to be made that many of us are living in a collectively liminal moment. We are between worlds, between technologies, identities, and between social structures. We're between stories. The old narrative is incomplete, and the new narrative is not there yet. And that can feel deeply disorienting. And maybe that's why the Backrooms resonate. Not because they're supernatural, not because they're impossible, but because they capture a feeling that many struggle to articulate. The feeling of wandering through a world that is familiar, yet somehow no longer feels like home. The feeling of searching for meaning in an environment that wasn't designed for belonging. The feeling of looking around and realizing that everyone else seems just as lost. And perhaps that's the greatest irony. The Backrooms feel lonely, but the popularity of the Backrooms suggests something else. Millions of people recognized themselves in those images. Millions of people looked at those endless hallways and said, "Yes, I know that feeling." And in that recognition, perhaps there is something strangely hopeful. Because if loneliness is the experience of believing that we are alone, then recognizing ourselves in one another's wandering may be the beginning of connection. Which brings us to one final layer in this conversation. Because throughout history, places like these, thresholds, crossroads, abandoned buildings, forests, caves, and strange landscapes, have often been associated with something else. Not just loneliness, not just transformation, but encounters with mystery. The kinds of experiences that refuse easy explanations, the kinds of stories that become folklore, and the kinds of stories that bring us back to the paranormal. And maybe that's where this conversation was headed all along. Because throughout history, human beings have associated liminal spaces with something more than uncertainty, more than transformation or loneliness. They've associated them with mystery, encounters, with experiences that seem to exist just beyond the edge of ordinary reality. And what's fascinating is that this isn't unique to one culture, or one religion, or one historical period. Again and again, across centuries and continents, we find stories about thresholds. Places where the normal rules seem less certain. Places where something unexpected might happen. Places where people report seeing things, hearing things, dreaming things, encountering things that they cannot fully explain. And perhaps that's why the Backrooms feel so familiar. Because beneath the fluorescent lights and yellow wallpaper lies one of humanity's oldest stories, the threshold between worlds. If you spent any time exploring folklore, you'll quickly notice a pattern. Ghosts rarely appear in ordinary places. They appear at thresholds, in doorways, on bridges, stairwells, forests, abandoned buildings, edges, the places that exist between categories. The places where one thing becomes another. Anthropologists and folklorists have long noted that liminal spaces tend to attract supernatural stories, not necessarily because they are objectively more haunted, but because they occupy a unique place in the human imagination. They are spaces of uncertainty, and uncertainty invites story. Take crossroads, for example. Across Europe, Africa, and the Americas, crossroads have been associated with spirits, tricksters, deities, bargains, and encounters with the unknown. A crossroad is, by definition, a place of choice, a place where one path becomes many and where direction is uncertain. And so it becomes fertile ground for myth. The physical threshold becomes a symbolic one. The outer journey mirrors the inner journey. The same pattern appears in fairy lore. In Celtic traditions, particular attention was paid to thresholds, doorways, twilight, the borders between cultivated land and wilderness. Many stories warned that these were places where one might encounter the other world. Whether we interpret these stories literally, psychologically, or culturally, the symbolism remains striking. Transformation happens at the edge, not at the center. Even hauntings tend to follow this pattern. When people describe haunted locations, they often describe places that are themselves liminal. Old hospitals, abandoned schools, hotels, theaters, historic homes, places layered with memory. Places where many lives have intersected. Places that feel suspended between past and present. And this brings us to an interesting question. Why are humans so drawn to the idea that certain places remember? Because whether we're talking about ghosts, residual hauntings, sacred sites, or ancestral stories, many traditions contain some version of the same belief, that experiences leave traces, that memory can linger, and that the past is not entirely gone. Psychologically speaking, this isn't as strange as it might seem. Research on place attachment shows that humans form deep emotional bonds with locations. Places become intertwined with memory. A particular smell can transport us decades into the past. A song can evoke a specific room. A childhood home can trigger emotions before we've consciously identified them. The brain stores experience in context. Place and memory are deeply connected. And yet, many people report experiences that seem to go beyond memory alone. Dreams that feel more vivid than ordinary dreams. Moments of profound intuition. Experiences of sensing a deceased loved one. Coincidences that feel meaningful. Stories that persist across cultures and generations despite radically different worldviews. These experiences have been studied by psychologists, anthropologists, theologians, neuroscientists, and paranormal researchers alike. And while explanations differ, one thing remains consistent: human beings continue to have them. One of the most common examples involves bereavement experiences. Research has found that many people report sensing the presence of a deceased loved one after loss, seeing, hearing, or dreaming of them, feeling them nearby. For some, these experiences are understood psychologically, for others, spiritually, and for some, both. But regardless of interpretation, they often occur during periods of transition, periods of grief or liminality, moments when life has been fundamentally altered. Carl Jung would likely not have been surprised. Jung believed that symbolic experiences often emerge during times of psychological transformation, not because the psyche is malfunctioning, but because it is reorganizing itself. The unconscious becomes louder, dreams become richer, and symbols become more meaningful. Our attention shifts, and people begin noticing connections that they previously overlooked. This is one reason I find paranormal experiences so fascinating. Not because I think every story should be accepted uncritically, and not because every mystery requires a supernatural explanation, but because the experiences themselves are real, and the meaning that people derive from them is real. The transformation that follows them is real, and often, those experiences emerge in the same kinds of spaces we've been discussing throughout this episode. Thresholds, which brings us back to the backrooms. The backrooms are, in many ways, a modern haunted landscape, not because they're full of ghosts, but because they're full of questions. They invite us into uncertainty, into ambiguity, and into the space between explanation and mystery. That space has always been fertile ground for paranormal imagination, not because we are irrational, not because we are gullible, but because human beings have always sought meaning in the unknown. Whether we call those experiences hauntings, synchronicities, dreams, visions, spiritual encounters, or just moments of wonder, they ask something of us. Not necessarily belief, but attention, curiosity, and humility. The willingness to admit that reality may be larger than our current explanations. And perhaps that is the true gift of liminal spaces. Not certainty, but openness. Because once we allow ourselves to remain curious at the threshold, something interesting happens. The hallway changes. The labyrinth changes. The underworld changes. Perhaps most importantly, we change. Which brings us to the final question of this episode. If the backrooms are not really about monsters, if they're not really about architecture, and they're not even really about horror, let's return to the question that started this episode. Why do the backrooms resonate? Why does an image of endless hallways and fluorescent lights feel so strangely familiar? Because after everything we've explored today, I don't think the backrooms are really about a place. I think they're about a feeling most of us know intimately, the feeling of being between stories. Perhaps why this modern myth found such fertile ground is because many of us are living through profound uncertainty. Politically, economically, socially, spiritually, and technologically, the world is changing. The rules are changing, and the stories we inherited are changing. And many people find themselves asking questions they never expected to ask. Questions about identity, meaning, purpose, belonging, community, and truth. Questions that don't have easy answers. Questions that cannot be solved by scrolling faster or gathering more information. Questions that require us to remain in the threshold a little bit longer. And if there's one thing mythology, spirituality, psychology, and even folklore seem to agree on, it's this. The threshold is not a mistake. The wandering is not a failure. The uncertainty is not evidence that you've lost your way. Sometimes uncertainty is the path. Sometimes getting lost is what allows us to find something we otherwise would have missed. I think about the countless stories of people who emerged from grief, illness, heartbreak, or crisis with a deeper understanding of themselves than they had before. Not because the experience was easy or the suffering is inherently noble, but because the threshold changed them. And maybe that's the invitation hidden within the backrooms. not to escape, but to become curious. What is this space trying to teach me? What part of my life feels liminal right now? What if uncertainty is not my enemy, but my teacher? Because whether we're talking about haunted places, dreams, mythology, or spiritual experiences, I suspect we're all exploring the same thing. The mystery of being human, the mystery of becoming, the mystery of standing between what was and what comes next. And perhaps that mystery is not something to solve. Perhaps it's something to witness. Before we close, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you seen the Backrooms? Did it resonate with you? Have you experienced a season of life that felt like wandering through endless hallways without a map? What myths, stories, films, dreams, or experiences have helped you to make sense of your own liminal spaces? If you'd like to continue the conversation, I'd love to invite you over to Patreon. Patreon has become a place where we can explore these ideas a little more deeply, sharing reflections, behind-the-scenes thoughts, and bonus content, and conversations that don't always fit neatly into a public episode. It's also a place where you can help support the continued creation of this podcast and the research, writing, and curiosity that goes into each episode. You can find the link in the show notes. Until next time, stay curious, stay open, and remember, what matters most isn't what we experience, it's how it transforms us. Thank you for listening to the Liminal Mind. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review, sharing it with a friend, or supporting the show on Patreon.